As I said, welcome formally to British Cartographic Society's winter lecture. And we are absolutely delighted to have with us Dr. Philippe Frey, who's curator of the map collection of the Federal Office of Topography, swisstopo. He studied as a historian at Claremont College in California, and he wrote his doctoral thesis at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. And he holds advanced degrees in archival and library studies. And his research focus is on the history of cartography and global and cultural history. He's going to talk to us today about the Federal Office of Topography, swisstopo, and the history of cartography in Switzerland. And I know for anybody that's involved in cartography, hold the mapping that's produced by the Swiss in very high esteem. So it's really exciting to have you here with us, Philip. It's all yours. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'll share my screen. I hope you can see the first slide now of the presentation with title The Federal Office of Topography, swisstopo, and the History of Cartography in Switzerland. The subtitle is Maps and Mountains, and that's because one of the first things that come to mind when speaking or even thinking about Switzerland is mountains. The Alps dominate from the southwest across to the eastern borders, and in the northwest, the Jura shape the Swiss landscape. As mountains often played a certain, sometimes also symbolic role in the history of the country, they also interacted heavily with the task of map making. In today's presentation, I'll give an oversight of the history of official map making in Switzerland, and also touch on the subject of what Swiss mountains, but also other mountains in other parts of the world, have to do with Swiss cartography. In my presentation, I will first talk about the Topographic Map of Switzerland, the so-called Dufour map. Then in a second part about the Topographic Atlas of Switzerland, also known as Siegfried map. We'll talk then in a third part about the national map and take you on a little mountain excursion outside of Switzerland. First, the Topographic Map of Switzerland, the so-called Dufour map. It was the first official series of maps that encompassed the whole of the country. It was published in the period from 1845 to 1865. Following initial efforts in the time of the Helvetic Republic from 1798 to 1803 under heavy French influence, the earliest surveys of Switzerland were carried out by officers of the General Staff from 1809 onwards. Excuse me. The earliest surveys were taken on from 1809 onwards. However, it was not until Guillaume-Henri Dufour was appointed Chief of General Staff of the still loose Swiss Confederation in 1832 that map production really began to make progress. Dufour was in ways predestined for this duty, as he served as a military engineer in the French army when his hometown Geneva was still part of the French Empire. This all took off after the Commission for Topographical Surveys had developed a complete concept for surveying and mapping the entire country. Dufour's duties included now the creation of the 1 to 100,000 Topographic Map of Switzerland. The arrangement of the 25 sheets is still used today for the national map in that scale. Each sheet covers 70 kilometers west to east by 48 kilometers north to south. Thus, the entire work encompassed an area of 350 by 240 kilometers. As you can see, the corner pages were reserved for the title and other additional items. and contained only limited topographic information, such as some of altitude and oversight to the sheets. Dufour worked closely together with numerous scientists, topographers, and copperplate engravers. Between 1834 and 1837, it was astronomer Johannes Eschmann who succeeded in joining several already existing cantonal networks to form a triangulation, the so-called triangulation primordiale. This presented the actual first nationwide triangulation that connected the north of the Alps with regions to the south. In 1840, Eschmann published the results, which were used as geodetic reference system for the Dufour map. Once the triangulation had been completed on the big scale, Dufour was able to issue instructions for the detailed topographic surveys. For this purpose, Dufour had to form a network that supplied him with topographic data. Therefore, he founded the Topographic Bureau or Office near Geneva in 1838. The Central Plateau, the Jura, and the Southern Ticino were documented using the scale of 1 to 25,000, while 1 to 50,000 was used for the Alpine regions. SwissTopo refers to the material produced at this stage as original surveys. Some cantons published cantonal maps that were funded in part by private investors and in part by the cantons themselves. The basic data for these maps was put at the disposal of the Office of Dufour. The yellow sections that you see on this map showed areas that had private investors, while the green and red show cantonal efforts. The big rest in blue, especially the mountains to the south, were mainly surveyed by Dufour's topographers. Here you can see an original survey. The results were beautiful, mainly hand-drawn original surveys as shown here. On the bottom right, you can actually see the Matterhorn, and north of it, several other peaks over 4,000 meters, among them the Dent Blanche, Zinal-Rothorn, and the Obergabelhorn. As you can imagine, topographers that produced the original surveys faced, especially in the Alps, difficult working conditions. Engineers with at least 3 assistants carrying theodolites crossed and measured glaciers and climbed mountain peaks. Several accidents, some of them deadly, occurred on the sometimes week-long journeys, and topographers not seldom slept in haystacks. You can imagine the load Dufour's topographers had to carry up those mountains. When you look at this picture that was taken about 70 to 80 years later, when the equipment was already much lighter. Dufour himself carefully examined the original surveys after they had been delivered to his office. These were then reduced to scale and engraved into copper and printed. The various forms of the landscapes were illustrated with the aid of shading, which resulted in a distinct three-dimensional impression. The last sheet was printed in 1865. At this time, the Topographical Bureau moved to Bern. A distortion analysis of the map revealed a mean deviation of 153 meters. In Natura, that means 1.5 millimeters on the map. But the work on the first official map of Switzerland was not a scientifically isolated act. It evolved in politically turbulent times. For the first part of the map project, the Topographic Office was part of the military of the loose confederation, or at the time alliance system, of still largely independent and sovereign cantons that preceded the formation of the modern state in 1848. In fact, it was the only federal institution at the time. The publication of the first two sheets of the map then also caused a certain uproar, as it showed the country in a way it had never been shown before. For example, sheet 16 that you see here, Geneva-Lausanne, showed by means of shading the land along Lake Geneva to the north as a unified entity, while the borders to France were highlighted and the borders between the Vaud and Geneva were barely visible. Similarly, on the impressive sheet 17, the cantons of Wallis, parts of Bern, Fribourg, and Vaud are unified by the three-dimensional mountainscape. The borders between the cantons are again barely visible, while the borders to France on the bottom left are clearly accentuated. The political reality of the time looked very different. As you can see on this map, the so-called Sonderbund was formed by largely conservative, Catholic, and rural countries, this map in yellow, among them Fribourg, Wallis, and the central Swiss cantons. They fought against the progressive, industrialized city cantons who endeavored to create a federal government and liberal state. In 1847, conflict erupted, and it was no other than Dufour who led the Swiss military as general to victory over the Sonderbund cantons. As a result, the modern Swiss state was founded a year later in 1848. Dufour had used for the map northwest lighting and the shading to depict the three-dimensional landscape. This depiction of a mountainous territory unified the country on paper and visualized the at the time not existing state. Dufour had successfully tapped into the deep-rooted Alpine myth of Switzerland. The Alps had already repeatedly served as integration symbol of the early Confederacy already in medieval times. The interest in Alpine research then at the beginning of the 18th century in ways provided the Confederacy with a natural legitimacy. In the highlighting of the mountains, the ones in the north as impressive as the in reality higher ones in the south, the map provided a vision of a unified land. After the war, in the second half of the 19th century, the map became very popular and much appreciated, and in due course won several international awards. In 1868, two federal acts entered into effect, enabling the continuation and the publication of topographic surveys. While work was still in progress on the Dufour map, geologists, railway construction engineers, as well as the Swiss Alpine Club, which was founded in 1863 and was modeled after the Alpine Club of Great Britain, were already expressing the wish for the original surveys to be published in the respective original scales of 1 to 25,000 for the Jura, the Central Plateau, and the Southern Ticino, and 1 to 50,000 for the Alps. At the same time, the military department was restructured to create a new staff bureau based on the French model, which was headed by Hermann Siegfried. One of his main duties as chief of staff was to prepare and publish the 1 to 25 and 1 to 50,000 Topographic Atlas of Switzerland, which is also referred to as the Siegfried map. The sheets were published between 1870 and 1926. They were updated until 1949. The Siegfried map was modeled on the map of the canton of Zurich, which had been published as a contour map. As a result, the areas of the country where the basis maps for the Dufour map were using shading would have to be resurveyed. Also, decisions had to be taken whether the existing data only needed to be revised or a new survey was required, particularly in connection with sheets for the mountains. The landscape forms were illustrated by means of contours, the equidistance of which was 10 meters for the Central Plateau and the Jura, and 30 meters respectively for the regions of the Alps. The Siegfried map is based on the same geodetic reference system as the Dufour map, though it consisted now of a much higher density of reference points. One of the changes was the introduction of the repère Pierre de Nitton, the two rocks in the port of Geneva, with 376.86 meters as the reference point for altitude measurements. The 1 to 25,000 sheet were reproduced as copperplate engravings, while the 1 to 50,000 sheets were reproduced as lithographs. Publication commenced in 1870, and the first editions were completed in 1922 for the 1 to 25,000 and 1926 for the 1 to 50,000. The entire map collection was updated until 1949, though no actual revision cycle is apparent. While the Dufour map can be described as the map of the new confederation, the Siegfried map may be regarded as the map of the 1874 revision of the Constitution. With its contours, the map provided a better visual oversight and enabled the use of the map for planning tasks, be it industrial or for the sake of mountain climbing. The cliff illustrations in particular received widespread praise thanks to the high degree of geological know-how of some of the topographers. Above all, the cliff drawings by Fridolin Becker and Xaver Imfeld, both of whom were pupils of renowned alpine geologist Albert Heim. Mentioning mountains, one of the driving forces behind the map was the Swiss Alpine Club. The map even depicted routes in the higher Alps as seen here across the Weisshorn. Here you can see what the mountain looks like on a photograph. International journals praised the map as best mountain map, and in many ways it functioned as the map of the golden age of mountain climbing in the Alps, and also the ongoing industrialization of Switzerland. The national maps of Switzerland that are in use today are based on the provisions of the legislation dating from 1935. The shortcomings of the existing sets of maps were already becoming increasingly apparent towards the end of the 19th century. Heterogeneous appearance, non-uniform data, outdated depictions by use of shading in the Dufour map, and limited coverage of the 1 to 25 and 1 to 50,000 scales by the Siegfried map. In 1936, the military department finally ordered the implementation of the main technical and organizational measures for replacing the Dufour and Siegfried maps with 6 new mutually supplementing sets of maps in scales ranging from 1 to 25,000 to 1 in a million. These sets are divided into a series of topographic maps and a series of geographic maps. The legislation from 1935 would remain relevant until 2008, when the Federal Geoinformation Act entered into force and provided the national map series with a new legal basis. One of the main arguments for the national map in the 1930s was the updating of the official survey in Switzerland with the CH 1903 reference system at the beginning of the 20th century. The move saw the introduction of the oblique conformal cylinder projection, now called Swiss grid, and the altitude of the repère Pierre de Nitton in the port of Geneva. This was defined as reference point for the LNO2 National Leveling Network, now at 373.6 meters. That means 3.2 meters lower than that used for the Siegfried map. In the mid-1930s, in view of increasing international tensions, priority was attached to the production of the 1 to 50,000 scale, which was initiated immediately in the Alps. The region's topographic data was collected by use of terrestrial photogrammetry, largely via the 1 to 10,000 fortification maps. When comparing map sets of different scales, it is thus important to note that the apparently homogeneous appearance of the map conceals its heterogeneous sources. Here you can see topographers on the strategic important Gotthard Pass in the time of the Second World War. Excuse me. The original survey plans were photographically reduced to scale of 1 to 10,000, and a mosaic was created by piecewise transferring municipalities onto a correctostat plate of practically distortion-free aluminum layered with paper. Based on this, editorial work was carried out in the field. Results were photographically reduced into the publication scale and copied on glass. It was decided to introduce a 6-year updating cycle in 1968. The geometry of the updating elements was calculated with the aid of aerophotogrammetry, while the stereo models in the analog evaluation devices were integrated directly into the 25,000 updating scale, and from approximately 1993 onwards on analytical plotters into non-signaled but distinct triangulation points. Cartographic reproduction was carried out using layer engraving on glass. The chemical composition of the layer was developed in 1989. From 1996 onwards, map production was successfully transferred to CAD systems. For this purpose, all films had to be scanned, and this meant that from 1992 onwards, it was also possible to offer national map sheets in digital form as pixel maps. Printing of maps on paper was carried out using the offset process. By 2014, SwissTopo published the first sheets of the so-called new national map. These are digital interactive maps that meet the needs of the modern nation state. Internationally, the Swiss national map stands out as already have its predecessors for one particular aspect. That is the depiction of mountains. I would like to mention now 2 examples of how the national map has in this regard literally spread across the Swiss borders. In 1960, when Mount Denali was still called Mount McKinley, a map of the mountain was published. The appearance resembled that of the national map. This was no coincidence, but the result of a collaboration. The mountaineer and cartographer Henry Bradford Washburn, who was also director of the Boston Museum of Science, wanted to use aerial photographs taken in 1951 and 1955 during US Air Force flights as the basis for a topographic map of Mount McKinley. His demands were high, and he wanted to base the McKinley map and its appearance on that of the Swiss national maps. From the beginning of the aerial image interpretation, drawing and engraving, up until the publication of the map, Washburn was in regular contact with the staff of SwissTopo and the photogrammetry operators of Wildheerbruck. For direct collaboration, Washburn also stayed at the headquarters of SwissTopo near Bern several times between 1957 and 1960. Great attention was paid to detail. Washburn functioned as the eyes and ears of the project on the ground. Accordingly, many map elements were shaped by his individual perception of the area. For example, big attention was paid to the rock formation. The 1,000-foot contours had to be handled perfectly, just dark enough to make them evident, just hidden enough so that they didn't spoil the effect of the rock drawing. Also, it was important to Washburn that the areas with vegetation on the northern edge of the map appeared in a vivid green, as you can see here on this slide. Mount McKinley map was though not the only map that was influenced by SwissTopo maps. There was also a balance of beauty and readability. Was also another mountain map. In 1988, the National Geographic magazine published a 1 to 50,000 scale map of Mount Everest in time to mark the National Geographic Society centenary and the 105th anniversary of SwissTopo. At SwissTopo, the finishing touches were made to a map that depicts the so-called roof of the world, similar to that of a national map. Again, it was Washburn in his function as director of the Boston Museum of Science, who had a very clear idea of what he wanted. That is to achieve a map that looked like a national map. It was in 1983 that the Columbia flew over the Himalayas and captured a series of stereo images. A Swedish Learjet 35 with a built-in Swiss Wild RC10 measuring camera was chartered to shoot the aerial photography. The Mount Everest map was completed at SwissTopo from 1986 to 1988. The structure of the rock and glaciers were rendered by hand. Airbrushing then gave the map its three-dimensional effect. Again, much attention was paid to the depiction of the landscape and rock formation to achieve a balance of aesthetics and readability. As you have seen, the official maps of Switzerland were always results of political processes and fulfilled the needs of society at a particular time. Also, the uniform appearance of the maps were often based on very heterogeneous surveys. In the Swiss case, as shown in this presentation, mountains take up a very special place in the history of map making in Switzerland. I'd like to now also inform you of some of the history-related products SwissTopo offers. Under the link map.geo.admin.ch, you can make time travel through the official maps of Switzerland from 1845 to the present. Then there is also the possibility to view aerial photographs of Switzerland from 1946, when the US Air Force photographed the country. And then there is also the possibility to make time travel through the aerophotography of SwissTopo from the 1970s to the present. Then this is a new thing swisstopo has to offer under memobase.ch. You can see the photographs, that is terrestrial and technical photographs of swisstopo that are online, and you can also see some spectacular mountain photography there and see the different reference points and photographs from the work processes. I really recommend you visit and see those spectacular photographs. Then we also have the swisstopo historic page we would like you to visit under swisstopohistoric.ch. And you can also read the historical blog of swisstopo on the main web page under swisstopo.admin.ch. In English, you go to knowledge and facts. You can get to space and time, and you can also read more about Mount McKinley, the different reference points, and an article about theodolites. There's many different things to discover from the history of swisstopo. Then I've also promised to share with you the email address, historic@swisstopo.ch, especially for more technical questions. My vocabulary may be not good enough for that. We answer within a week's time. Please, but I'll also, of course, attempt to answer your questions that you have now. So thank you for your attention and your interest in the history of this short flyover over the history of Swiss map making.
Philippe, that was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely enthralling. Can I ask anybody who's got questions? I'm sure you must have some out there to type them into chat, and then we can test Philippe's language skills, although they seem pretty good to me. So I don't think you've got anything to worry about. So let's please put something in the chat and we can pass them on. While you're typing those things in, hopefully some will pop up. Let me just ask you a couple of questions, if I may. I did love the notion that the Swiss Alpine Club was based on the Alpine Club of Great Britain. I'm not quite sure what we had to offer in terms of mountaineering experience, but given our little hills that we have here generally. But that was a lovely notion. Just going back to the early surveys and the conflicts that you had between the cantons, were the boundaries of the cantons at the time of which the surveys were being done properly recorded? They'd been surveyed in, or were they still pretty fluid?
Both. Some were still pretty fluid then, but they were recorded. So there's a little bit of both. So some borders still have in recent years. An example is the glacier of the Plaine Morte, which actually there's been disputes between the cantons of Wallis and the canton of Bern, to which part of the which canton the actual glacier is part of. To the south, you have the skiing resort of Grand Montana, and then the glacier itself now is the canton of Bern, even though the ski resort goes onto the glacier as well. So these disputes never really finish. We also had in the last year communes of the canton of Bern who decided to become parts of the, I think it was canton of Fribourg, and then of course with the canton of Jura. So there's some municipalities that change cantons actually. But in the surveys it was mainly in the reduction of the Dufour map then to the 1 in 100,000 scale, that some of the borders were not as visible anymore. Some weren't really shown at all. Some were still there, but it was more that accentuating to the future other countries, Germany, France, Italy. So the focus was more of showing what had to belong together and which was in the future another country.
Thank you. We have got some questions coming in, so I'll start reading some of them out. So Jim Goldsmith, do you have a personal favourite sheet?
I must say this sheet 17, which was published together with sheet 16 in 1845. Now the scan, because I'm had to do the zoom from the private computer, so it's been reduced a little bit it's not as good to scan anymore. But when you see the original of this sheet 17 with the depiction of the mountains, I must say it's one of the most impressive sheets. That, yeah, I think that must be one of my favorite ones.
Thank you. Alex Kent has asked, how important is it for Swiss Topo to retain a nationally distinctive cartographic style today?
Oh, I don't I don't know if I'm in the position to say that.
Well, very, very politically correct. We won't pursue that any further then.
Thank you.
Alex, you can pursue that offline. Dave Watt has asked, could you comment on the, oops, I've just lost it as they're going. Hang on a moment. They're coming in quick and fast. Could you comment on the current relationship between Swiss Topo and the map making services of the individual cantons?
Well, there's certainly, I'm not directly involved in how that works today. There's certainly, when you look at it historically, it changed a lot in the last 175 years. So in the 19th century, there's been conflicts over, especially in the beginning of the Dufour map, of which region is called what and what names were used on the map and so on. So then there was also the famous comment by Dufour, who said, who decides, whose role is it to decide what is called what? Is it now the federal or is it the cantonal? Usually now it's by names the cantonal, but yeah, about the current state, I cannot say too much now.
Okay, thank you. Arthur Allen's asked, was there any connection between the topo mapping and the cadastral maps?
Yeah, the federal beginning of the 20th century, the federal government had how do I say this in English? Oberaufsicht over the cadastral maps, but is not actually producing them directly.
Okay, thank you. Ian Byrne has asked, commercial Swiss cartography, often by firms like Guillaume-Henri, Orwell Fuseli and Halvag, are also often has high quality depiction of mountains. Has there been formal collaboration between Swiss Topo and commercial companies, or have they just picked up the style?
Yeah, there's definitely some good maps that came from Krümmerli and Frey at the time. The geographic data is usually based on the data provided by swisstopo, and then it was published by other what do you call them, the publishers. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. A couple of comments. Drew Avery has just said, just checked out the swisstopo journey through time. That's a nice piece of work, exclamation mark, or several of them. So clearly he's impressed by it. I guess everybody should go and have a look at that. It sounds like it's very, very, very fascinating. From Paul Naylor, great presentation, Philippe, thank you. Map Tyler recently launched swisstopo vector maps, and your amazing hand-drawn raster relief is included as part of that. So has swisstopo ever tried to create terrain digitally, is the question.
Created terrain digitally?
So have you, yeah, the hand-drawn shading, if you like, of the mountains, have you ever tried to do that digitally, or is it still a hand-drawn process?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
So in the mount, I think what he's getting at is in the mounting areas where you have hand-drawn shading to depict the relief. Has that ever been tried to be done automatically through computers, or is it still a hand-drawn process?
Today,
yeah.
Well, we have the topographic landscape model. I cannot really say how much of handwork still goes into the digital process. That's not quite sure how that works today, but I can find out. Okay,
we'll get Paul to send you an email for a technical question.
Yeah, please,
that's really something you could pass on and ask about. We have a question, it's quite a long question here from Ryland Karlovic. It's been said that sorry, it's moving as the questions come in, apologize. It's been said that Dent Blanche and Dent Herens were mistaken for each other during the original surveys by Dufour. I hope I've pronounced those names right, with the result that the mountains were mislabeled for each other on the maps, which are now the permanent names. Is there any credibility behind this, or has it been verified through any records? So a misnaming of two mountains, does that mean anything to you or ring any bells?
Dent Blanche and Dent Herens. I'm actually not sure if I would have to double check. I'm not sure. There's definitely been at that time discussions over some mountain peaks being called something that some people then regionally didn't agree with. There was discussion about that. I don't know about this particular case of Dent Blanche and Dent Herens. There's also been in one of the first sheets, also this 17 that I still have up, there was a mistake there with just one peak. There was a mistake with the altitude that absolutely didn't work. So there's definitely been some flaws at the beginning. Yeah, but the Dent Blanche and Dent Herens, interesting. I would have to double check that one. Yeah, I haven't heard that one.
We've got a few more questions, Philippe, but could you just put up that website again, the last slide, so that if anybody does want to ask you, or perhaps repeat these questions, and they can send them to the website?
Yeah.
That'd be great. While you're flicking through, there we are. Arthur Allen's asked again, what cooperation is there with neighbouring countries in terms of standardising topo across?
Oh, many. I don't directly have anything to do with it, so I can't tell you right away. As there is, for example, Bodensee Conference with German-speaking countries around, but there's also been with Italy about we've been in the newspaper a few times about borders in close to Zermatt, between Italy and Switzerland, because glaciers are moving, and there's been this discussion about the mountain hut that I believe used to be in Italy and should be in Switzerland now, or the other way around. But there's a lot of cooperation between the countries. For details, I would have to double check to give you a written answer on that.
Lovely, thank you. I'm sure if Arthur wants some more details, he can send you an email. Jim Goldsmith has asked, how long did it take to create and replace the monochrome with full color?
Let me see, maybe I'll have this right here. No, I don't see it right now, but we can check that. That's no problem.
Okay, and another question. Someone who's, I guess, asking because they've got a particular interest or some research, to see the shrinking of glaciers due to climate change, would this person have to look at each individual map for each year stroke decade, or is there any resource for this on SwissTopo?
Well, the glaciers were in the original surveys very carefully measured. So if you do go on the time travel page, you can zoom in and actually see some of the evolvement of the glaciers. There's a problem though with it, and that is they weren't measured every time. That means, yeah, the original ones at one point are pretty correct data, but then they weren't resurveyed every time a new map came out. So it wouldn't be very reliable just to rely on those maps. There is the Institute of Glaciology, I think it's called, at the ETH, that are the reference for that can really provide the data. And yeah, the problem is really that they weren't for a long time not measured in the 19th century for good portions because it was too expensive and they didn't have the money to really measure the glaciers in every cycle.
Lovely, thank you. I seem to have exhausted the question list for now. If anybody does have any more, you have an email address that you could send them to Philip for. That was absolutely fantastic. A brilliant talk. Thank you very much. For those who are BCS members and interested about some of the things we're doing later on, it's worth me just letting you know that the British Cartographic Society is joining up with the Swiss, the Austrians and the Germans in supporting a Eurocarto event that's taking place, I believe in Vienna, I'm right saying, in September, as part of one of the International Cartographic Association's regional events. So delighted to be involved with that. And for those of you who are fascinated by mountain cartography or the Swiss experience in particular, I'm sure there'll be plenty more to learn at that event. So Philip, thank you very much for your time and effort. That was brilliant. We really appreciate it. And
thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.